Part 1: The Boy Who Built Worlds in a Houston Bedroom. The summer heat of 1979 pressed against the windows of a modest ranch-style house in Houston, Texas, where an 8-year-old boy sat cross-legged on the carpet of his bedroom, arranging miniature objects with the precision of a museum curator. Wesley Wales Anderson had discovered something profound in the geometry of his possessions. Action figures didn't simply exist. They could be staged. The afternoon light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting perfectly parallel shadows across his constructed dioramas. And in that moment, though he couldn't have articulated it, young Wes had stumbled upon the foundational principle that would define his life's work. His parents' divorce had fractured the Anderson household just 2 years prior, a wound that never quite healed in the conventional sense but instead calcified into something else entirely, a lens through which a sensitive child began to see the world as a series of carefully managed facades, emotional architectures that could be controlled, at least aesthetically, even when everything else felt chaotic. His mother, Anne Baumgarten, a real estate broker with an eye for order, and his father, Melver Anderson, an advertising executive who trafficked in manufactured desire, had given him a peculiar inheritance, an understanding that presentation mattered, that surfaces told stories, and that the arrangement of objects in space could communicate what words could not. The Anderson boys, Wes and his brothers Eric and Mel, navigated their fractured family geography between two homes, two sets of rules, two distinct emotional climates. But Wes found consistency elsewhere. He discovered it in the local movie theater, a dark sanctuary where the outside world dissolved and was replaced by something more reliable: narrative. The late 1970s were a particular time for American cinema, caught between the gritty realism of the new Hollywood movement and the approaching blockbuster era. Young Anderson absorbed everything: Hal Ashby's deadpan melancholy, François Truffaut's playful humanity, the Coen brothers' emerging sensibility of worlds unto themselves. But it was the discovery of older films, the classics his mother introduced him to, that truly reconfigured his understanding of what movies could be. He watched Mike Nichols' The Graduate and saw how color and composition could create meaning. He encountered Orson Welles and learned that a single frame could contain multitudes. Most significantly, he discovered the French New Wave, those rebellious filmmakers of the 1960s who had treated cinema not as mere entertainment, but as a canvas for personal vision. Jean-Luc Godard's jump cuts, Jacques Demy's artificial color palettes, and especially Truffaut's The 400 Blows, with its child protagonist navigating adult disappointments, spoke directly to something inside him. At St. John's School, an exclusive private institution in Houston where Wes enrolled as a teenager, he was neither athletic nor particularly social in the conventional sense. He was skinny, bespectacled, and possessed an intensity about certain subjects that marked him as different. While his classmates obsessed over sports statistics and social hierarchies, Anderson filled notebooks with sketches, ideas, fragments of dialogue. His teachers noticed something peculiar. When assigned to write a standard 5-paragraph essay, Wes would instead submit elaborate narrative constructions, complete with stage directions and visual notes. It was at St. John's that Anderson met the Wilson brothers, Owen and Luke, and this encounter would prove to be one of those rare convergences that altered the trajectory of multiple lives. Owen Wilson was, in almost every measurable way, Anderson's opposite: tall, athletic, blonde, with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his place in the world. He was also frequently in trouble, a charming troublemaker whose disciplinary record suggested either a future in prison or something more interesting. Luke, Owen's younger brother, possessed a similar charisma but with a more grounded quality, an emotional accessibility that balanced Owen's manic energy. The friendship that developed between Wes Anderson and Owen Wilson was one of those inexplicable chemistries that occasionally occur between fundamentally different personalities. They bonded over a shared sense of absurdity, an appreciation for the ridiculous elements of their privileged prep school existence, and an intuition that the official narratives they were being fed, about success, about masculinity, about what their lives should become, were somehow incomplete. They began writing together, first as a joke, then more seriously. Owen would spin out wild stories, improvisational riffs that had no structure but tremendous energy. Wes would take these raw materials and shape them, finding the architecture within the chaos, discovering the emotional truth beneath the comedy. The late 1980s found Anderson preparing for the next phase of his education. He applied to the University of Texas at Austin, which housed one of the few serious film programs in the Southwest. His application materials were characteristically unusual. Alongside the standard academic transcripts were elaborate storyboards, fragments of screenplays, and a letter of intent that read more like a manifesto than a college essay. He was accepted, and in the fall of 1986, he drove the 165 miles from Houston to Austin, his car packed with books, cameras, and a certainty that bordered on delusion. He was going to make films. The University of Texas film program in the late 1980s was a strange ecosystem, populated by serious cinephiles and wealthy dilettantes, by genuine artists and those who merely enjoyed the idea of being artists. Anderson arrived with a work ethic that surprised even his most dedicated peers. While others treated film school as an extension of undergraduate socializing, Wes approached it with monastic dedication. He watched 3, sometimes 4 films a day, taking meticulous notes. He studied not just American cinema but the international masters, Satyajit Ray's humanist epics, Yasujiro Ozu's Tadamashot domestic dramas, Jean Renoir's fluid choreography of actors and camera. His student films were immediately distinctive, though not always successful. There was a fastidiousness to them, a concern with symmetry and color that struck some professors as affected, even pretentious. One early short film featured characters speaking in highly stylized dialogue while arranged in rigidly symmetrical compositions, the camera moving only in perfectly horizontal tracking shots or static tableaus. A professor wrote on his evaluation, "Technically proficient. Emotionally unclear. Seems more interested in surfaces than substance." This criticism stung because it struck close to a fear Anderson harbored about himself, that his obsession with aesthetic control was a defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the messy emotional directness that characterized the work of filmmakers he admired. But he pressed forward, trusting an instinct he couldn't fully articulate. The films that moved him most deeply, The Graduate, Harold and Maude, even Truffaut's work, combined formal precision with genuine feeling. Why couldn't both exist simultaneously? Why did emotion require shaky cam and naturalism? Couldn't there be a cinema that was both controlled and heartfelt, artificial and true? During his junior year, Anderson began developing a feature-length screenplay, something beyond the scope of a typical student project. He was thinking about his family, about the particular species of American dysfunction that his parents' divorce represented, not violent or dramatic, but quiet, polite, decorated with nice furniture and good manners even as everything fell apart underneath. He thought about his own adolescence, about the performance of normalcy, about how people construct elaborate social architectures to avoid dealing with actual feelings. Owen Wilson had also ended up in Austin, though through a more circuitous route involving expulsion from a New Mexico military academy and some gentle familial intervention. The Wilson family, like the Andersons, belonged to that particular stratum of Texas society where real wealth was concealed behind understated affluence, where crisis was managed through discretion and rehabilitation occurred at expensive out-of-state facilities. Owen had stories, endless stories, and Wes had structure. They began meeting regularly at a coffee shop near campus, working on what would become Bottle Rocket. The screenplay that emerged from these sessions was unusual. It centered on three friends, Dignan, Anthony, and Bob, who decide to become criminals despite having no aptitude, need, or realistic understanding of what that entails. On the surface, it was a crime comedy. Beneath that, it was about something else entirely, about young men trying to impose narrative structure on their directionless lives, about the stories we tell ourselves to feel significant, about friendship as a form of mutual delusion that occasionally produces something like grace. Anderson applied for funding through various University of Texas programs and was rejected. The screenplay was deemed too quirky, too uncommercial, too concerned with character over plot. But Wes had absorbed something from his advertising executive father: persistence in the face of rejection, the ability to keep pitching even when the answer was no. He and Owen decided to make a short film version of Bottle Rocket as proof of concept, something they could use to demonstrate their vision. They scrounged together $13,000, mostly from Wes's family connections and Owen's willingness to ask everyone he knew for money. They shot the short film over several days in Dallas, using friends and family members as crew, maxing out credit cards for equipment rentals, and generally operating on a combination of naive confidence and desperate determination. The resulting 13-minute film captured something essential: a distinctive visual style, symmetrical compositions, deadpan performances, a color palette of yellows and blues, married to emotional sincerity, comedy that emerged from character rather than jokes. As the summer of 1992 approached and Anderson prepared to graduate from the University of Texas, he had this short film, a feature-length screenplay, and a growing certainty that he had discovered his life's purpose. But he also had no money, no industry connections, and no clear path forward in an American film industry that was in the midst of another transformation, where independent cinema was becoming simultaneously more accessible and more competitive. The question wasn't whether he wanted to make films; that was settled. The question was whether wanting something badly enough, working obsessively enough, caring intensely enough about every small detail could overcome the simple math of an industry that crushed thousands of hopeful filmmakers for every one it elevated. He didn't know the answer yet. But he was about to find out. Part 2: The Years of Rejection and the Miracle of Sundance. The apartment Wes Anderson shared with Owen Wilson in Los Angeles during the fall of 1992 was a testament to creative poverty disguised as bohemian choice. Located in a nondescript building off Pico Boulevard, the two-bedroom unit contained little beyond a futon, a small television perpetually tuned to TCM, and walls gradually being covered with index cards containing scene breakdowns, character notes, and dialogue fragments for the feature-length Bottle Rocket they were determined to make. The rent was $1,100 a month, which felt like a fortune when either of them had consistent employment. Los Angeles in the early 1990s presented a particular kind of promise to young filmmakers. Quentin Tarantino had just exploded onto the scene with Reservoir Dogs in 1992, proving that a distinctive voice combined with modest resources could break through. The Sundance Film Festival, which had spent the 1980s gradually elevating from a small Utah gathering into the primary marketplace for American independent cinema, was minting new auteurs annually. Kevin Smith would soon make Clerks for $27,000. Robert Rodriguez had famously financed El Mariachi by volunteering for medical testing. The mythology of independent filmmaking suggested that talent and tenacity could overcome institutional gatekeeping. But mythology and reality diverged sharply. For every Tarantino, there were thousands of aspiring filmmakers working retail jobs, accumulating credit card debt, and watching their carefully crafted screenplays disappear into the void of Hollywood indifference. Anderson and Wilson joined this anonymous army, sending their 13-minute bottle rocket short film to every film festival, production company, and talent agency they could identify. Most never responded. Some sent form rejection letters. A few offered vague encouragement before passing. Anderson took a job at a video rental store in Santa Monica, one of those cathedral-like establishments that characterized pre-streaming cinema culture, with floor-to-ceiling shelves organized by director and genre. He worked the evening shift, which allowed him to spend mornings writing and afternoons making phone calls to industry contacts he didn't actually have. His coworkers remember him as intensely focused, almost monastic in his dedication. While others chatted between customers, Wes read film criticism, studied screenplays he'd photocopied at Kinko's, and filled legal pads with notes about camera movements and color theory. Owen, by contrast, seemed constitutionally incapable of the kind of sustained anxiety that fueled Anderson's work ethic. He picked up occasional acting work, small television roles, commercial auditions that went nowhere, and treated their entire Los Angeles adventure with a kind of bemused confidence that either reflected genuine faith or a defense mechanism so complete it was indistinguishable from the real thing. Their creative partnership depended on this temperamental difference. Wes provided structure, discipline, and an almost obsessive attention to craft. Owen brought spontaneity, emotional instability transformed into comedy, and a willingness to fail publicly that Wes found simultaneously terrifying and liberating. The screenplay they were developing had evolved significantly from the short film. The feature-length Bottle Rocket retained the central trio: Dignan, the delusional ringleader, Anthony, the depressive romantic, and Bob, the wealthy tag-along, but expanded the scope considerably. The narrative now followed their botched criminal career through multiple failed robberies, an interlude at a rural motel where Anthony falls in love with a Paraguayan housekeeper, and a climactic heist that goes predictably, tragically wrong. But the plot was almost secondary to what Anderson was really trying to achieve: a visual and tonal language that could be simultaneously stylized and emotionally honest. He spent hours constructing shot lists for a film that didn't have financing, couldn't secure actors, and might never get made. Each scene existed as a precise visual schematic in his notebooks: the exact camera height, the color of each costume element, the specific props that would populate each frame. His friends thought he was crazy, preparing with such detail for a project that was, by any reasonable assessment, a fantasy. But Anderson had internalized something essential: that the difference between professional and amateur wasn't just talent or connections, but a willingness to treat unreal things as real until they became so. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived in early 1993, came through a channel so improbable it seemed almost cosmically ordained. A producer named Cynthia Hargrave, who worked in the orbit of James L. Brooks, the legendary writer-director-producer behind Terms of Endearment, Broadcast News, and The Simpsons, had somehow acquired a VHS copy of the Bottle Rocket short film. Exactly how the tape reached her remains unclear. Different accounts suggest a University of Texas connection, a film festival screening, or simply the mysterious circulation systems through which such materials traveled in pre-digital Hollywood. Hargrave watched the 13-minute film and saw something. Not a polished masterpiece, but a distinctive sensibility, a particular way of seeing that couldn't be taught or imitated. She passed the tape to Brooks himself, and here the story enters the realm of Anderson mythology. Brooks, one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood, supposedly watched the short film 3 times in succession, then asked to meet these unknown kids from Texas. The meeting occurred in March 1993 at Brooks's production office on the Sony lot in Culver City. Anderson prepared with characteristic intensity, arriving with multiple versions of the screenplay, detailed production budgets at various funding levels, visual reference materials, and a presentation that bordered on manic in its thoroughness. He expected a brief courtesy meeting, a few polite questions, and the gentle brush-off that characterized most Hollywood encounters. Instead, Brooks engaged seriously with the material. He asked detailed questions about character motivation, about why Anderson had made specific visual choices in the short film, about what he was trying to say beneath the surface comedy. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Owen, who had tagged along expecting to provide moral support, found himself actually participating in a substantive creative discussion with a genuine Hollywood legend. At one point, Brooks asked Anderson directly, "Why do you want to make this movie? What is it really about for you?" Wes's answer, according to those present, was uncharacteristically personal. He talked about his parents' divorce, about the peculiar pretense of his Texas upbringing where emotional dysfunction was carefully concealed behind social propriety, about feeling like he was always performing a role even in his own life. He talked about how Dignan's delusional confidence was both absurd and heroic, how the film was ultimately about friendship as a form of shared delusion that makes life bearable. Brooks listened, nodded, and then said something that Anderson would repeat in interviews for decades. "I believe you. I believe you know what you're trying to do." Gracie Films, Brooks's production company, agreed to finance a feature-length version of Bottle Rocket with a budget of $5 million, a modest sum by Hollywood standards but an almost unfathomable fortune to Anderson and Wilson. The development process would take 2 years, during which Anderson would receive a salary sufficient to quit his video store job and focus entirely on refining the screenplay. Columbia Pictures would distribute the film, giving it access to actual theaters rather than the film festival circuit where most independent films lived and died. The intervening period between securing financing and actual production was simultaneously exhilarating and excruciating. Anderson had spent years preparing for this opportunity, but now faced the reality of professional filmmaking, studio notes, budget constraints, the necessity of casting recognizable actors to satisfy distribution requirements, and the discovery that his elaborate visual schemes often conflicted with practical production realities. The casting process proved particularly challenging. Columbia wanted stars, or at least recognizable character actors, in the lead roles. Anderson wanted to cast Owen Wilson as Dignan, the delusional criminal mastermind at the story's center, but Owen had no professional acting credits beyond a few commercials. The compromise was to populate supporting roles with established actors. James Caan agreed to play a small-time criminal that Dignan idolizes, lending the project immediate credibility, while allowing Anderson to cast his friends in lead roles. Luke Wilson, Owen's younger brother, took the role of Anthony, the depressive romantic. Bob Musgrave, a friend from the Dallas filming of the short, played Bob Mapplethorpe, the wealthy getaway driver. The decision to cast unknowns in the central roles was either brave or foolish, depending on whether the film succeeded or failed. Anderson treated it as non-negotiable. These characters had emerged from his specific relationship with Owen, from their particular chemistry and shared sensibility. Professional actors could deliver better technical performances, but they couldn't replicate the authentic connection between people who had actually lived together, struggled together, and developed this story as a collaborative act of creative survival. Principal photography began in March 1995, primarily in Dallas and surrounding areas. Anderson was 25 years old, directing his first feature film with a $5 million budget and the backing of one of Hollywood's most respected producers. The experience was overwhelming. He had prepared meticulously. Every shot was storyboarded, every costume element selected, every prop carefully chosen, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer velocity of professional film production, where dozens of crew members waited for his decisions, where every minute of delay cost money, where his elaborate visual schemes confronted the simple physics of available light and limited time. His directorial style, even in these early days, was distinctive to the point of being eccentric. He insisted on perfectly symmetrical compositions, even when this required repositioning entire sets. He demanded precise color coordination, sending costume designers back repeatedly to find exactly the right shade of yellow for a particular shirt. He required actors to deliver dialogue in a specific deadpan cadence that felt natural to him but struck many crew members as artificial. Several cinematographers and production designers who worked on Bottle Rocket later described Anderson as simultaneously the most prepared and most demanding director they'd encountered, someone who knew exactly what he wanted but required exhaustive iteration to achieve it. The famous opening sequence of Bottle Rocket, in which Dignan helps Anthony escape from a voluntary psychiatric hospitalization by lowering a rope from a window, took 3 days to shoot, despite being less than 2 minutes of screen time. Anderson required 18 takes of a simple shot of Owen Wilson walking across a lawn, adjusting the camera height by millimeters between takes, searching for a geometric precision that existed primarily in his own mind. The crew grew restless, then resentful, then finally resigned to Anderson's methodology. Either they were watching a young perfectionist discover his voice or enabling an obsessive's delusions. Only the finished film would reveal which. The production wrapped in May 1995, and Anderson entered the editing process with the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized filming. He worked with editor David Moritz for 6 months, constructing a 91-minute film that moved at a deliberately unhurried pace, allowing scenes to breathe, permitting awkward silences and seemingly mundane moments to accumulate emotional weight. The rough cut he showed to Columbia executives was met with confusion. The film wasn't exactly a comedy, despite being frequently funny. It wasn't a crime thriller, despite involving robberies. It wasn't a coming-of-age story, despite being fundamentally about young men figuring out their lives. It was something else entirely, something that didn't fit established categories. The studio's marketing department struggled to sell a film they couldn't easily describe. The initial test screenings were disastrous. Audiences expecting a conventional heist comedy found Bottle Rocket's deadpan rhythms alienating, even boring. Columbia began lowering expectations, reducing the promotional budget, and considering a limited release that would essentially bury the film in a handful of art house theaters. Bottle Rocket premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 1996, 4 years after Anderson and Wilson had arrived in Los Angeles with nothing but a 13-minute short film and delusional confidence. The Sundance screening was not triumphant. The audience response was polite but tepid, the reviews were mixed at best, and no bidding war emerged from distributors hoping to acquire the next indie sensation. Columbia proceeded with a minimal release in February 1996, opening Bottle Rocket in a handful of cities with almost no advertising support. The film died quietly at the box office, earning just $560,000 against its $5 million budget. It was, by every conventional measure, a commercial failure. The Los Angeles Times called it too slight and meandering to sustain feature length. The New York Times praised its offbeat charm, but noted it felt like a short film stretched uncomfortably thin. Variety predicted, with brutal accuracy, that it would disappear quickly from theaters. But 3 critics saw something else. Martin Scorsese, in an interview with Premiere magazine, listed Bottle Rocket among his favorite films of 1996, calling it a remarkable debut that announces a genuine filmmaker. The legendary Pauline Kael, then retired from active criticism, reportedly told friends that Anderson was the real thing. And most significantly, film critic Owen Gleiberman wrote in Entertainment Weekly, "Anderson has created a world entirely his own, and I wanted to stay in it longer." Wes Anderson was 26 years old. His first film had failed commercially, received mixed reviews, and would require another decade to find its cult audience through home video. He had spent 4 years of his life, from the initial short film to the theatrical release, creating something that the market had decisively rejected. The question now was whether he would get another chance, or whether Bottle Rocket would be his only film, a footnote in the history of interesting failures. The answer would depend on whether persistence mattered more than immediate success, and whether Hollywood occasionally rewarded distinctive voices even when they didn't generate immediate profits. Part 3: The Gamble of Rushmore and the Discovery of a Visual Language. The 18 months following Bottle Rocket's theatrical failure were among the most uncertain of Wes Anderson's young career. In the harsh mathematics of Hollywood, where success begets opportunity and failure begets silence, he should have disappeared entirely. First-time directors with commercially unsuccessful films rarely received second chances, particularly when their work resisted easy categorization and had generated tepid audience response. The industry functioned on momentum, and Anderson had none. Yet something unexpected happened during late 1996 and early 1997. Bottle Rocket began accumulating a peculiar kind of cultural capital. The film appeared on year-end lists from critics who championed idiosyncratic voices. Video rental stores reported consistent circulation despite the theatrical failure. Film students and aspiring directors discussed it with the kind of obsessive attention typically reserved for established classics. It was developing what would later be called a cult following, though at the time this phenomenon provided no financial security or career advancement. Anderson spent this period in a kind of creative purgatory, living in Los Angeles on minimal savings, writing constantly but with no guarantee that anything he wrote would be produced. He was aware that the cultural moment was shifting around him. The independent film boom of the early 1990s was cresting. Films like Pulp Fiction, Fargo, and Sling Blade had proven that distinctive voices could generate substantial commercial returns. But the market was also becoming saturated, with every film festival producing dozens of would-be auteurs, each claiming to possess a unique vision. The screenplay Anderson began developing in late 1996 emerged from a different emotional space than Bottle Rocket. Where the first film had been about directionless young men inventing purpose through elaborate delusion, this new project, eventually titled Rushmore, concerned itself with adolescent ambition, intellectual pretension, and the specific pain of being intellectually advanced but emotionally immature. The central character, Max Fisher, was a 15-year-old student at an elite preparatory academy, a boy who excelled at extracurricular activities, founder of numerous clubs, writer and director of elaborate stage productions, while failing academically and cultivating a sophisticated persona that barely concealed profound insecurity. The character drew heavily on Anderson's own prep school experience at St. John's, but filtered through a different sensibility. Where young Wes had been relatively quiet and observant, Max Fisher was aggressively performative, constantly constructing elaborate projects to demonstrate his intellectual sophistication and win the approval of adults he considered peers. The screenplay Anderson developed with Owen Wilson positioned Max in an unlikely love triangle with Herman Bloom, a wealthy industrialist experiencing a midlife crisis, and Rosemary Cross, a widowed elementary school teacher. Both older adults represented different responses to disappointment, Herman's bitter resignation versus Rosemary's quiet grief. The Rushmore screenplay was significantly more ambitious than Bottle Rocket in both narrative complexity and visual conception. Anderson envisioned the film as a heightened reality, where the prep school existed as an almost fantastical environment with its own internal logic, where Max's theatrical productions would be staged with elaborate production design, and where the visual language would more explicitly embrace the symmetrical compositions and precise color palettes that had characterized Bottle Rocket but had often conflicted with production realities. The challenge was finding financing. Columbia, having lost money on Bottle Rocket, had no interest in a second Anderson film. James L. Brooks remained supportive but couldn't unilaterally greenlight projects. The screenplay made the rounds of various production companies and studios throughout 1997, accumulating the same polite rejections Anderson had experienced before his first film. The feedback was consistent: too quirky, too specific, too concerned with a precocious teenager that mainstream audiences wouldn't find relatable. One studio executive told Anderson's agent that the script was brilliantly written but completely unmarketable. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Barry Mendel, a producer who had worked on films like The Sixth Sense, read the Rushmore screenplay and recognized something that others had missed. Beneath the stylized surface was a genuinely moving story about loneliness, ambition, and the specific pain of being young and brilliant and completely lost. Mendel brought the project to Joe Roth, then chairman of Walt Disney Studios, who had recently overseen the creation of Touchstone Pictures' specialty division for more adult-oriented films. Disney seemed an improbable home for a Wes Anderson film, but the studio's calculation was straightforward. The budget would be modest, eventually set at $10 million. The project had an acclaimed producer attached, and Anderson's Bottle Rocket had at least demonstrated a distinctive voice, even if it hadn't found an audience. In April 1997, nearly 2 years after Bottle Rocket's release, Anderson secured financing for his second film. The casting process for Rushmore proved transformative for Anderson's career in ways neither he nor the producers initially anticipated. The role of Max Fisher required an actor capable of balancing intellectual precociousness with genuine vulnerability, someone who could deliver Anderson's stylized dialogue without making it seem artificial. Hundreds of young actors auditioned. Most were technically proficient but wrong, either too knowing, too cute, or unable to locate the genuine emotion beneath Max's performative sophistication. Jason Schwartzman arrived at the audition through family connection. His mother was actress Talia Shire. His uncle was director Francis Ford Coppola, but with minimal acting experience beyond a few minor roles. He was 17 years old, already balding, with an intensity that registered as either genius or instability depending on the scene. Anderson had him read several times, experimenting with different emotional registers, and discovered something essential. Schwartzman understood Max Fisher from the inside because, in some fundamental way, he was Max Fisher, intellectually ambitious, socially awkward, desperately trying to construct an adult identity while still being obviously, painfully adolescent. The role of Herman Bloom, the depressed industrialist who befriends Max, went to Bill Murray in what proved to be the most consequential casting decision of Anderson's career. Murray in 1997 was in a strange professional place, still recognizable from his 1980s comedy stardom in films like Ghostbusters and Stripes, but largely absent from major film work, perceived as difficult and unreliable by industry standards. He had done interesting supporting work in films like Ed Wood and Kingpin, but nothing that suggested the dramatic depth Anderson's screenplay required. Anderson and Murray met in late 1997, and the director discovered that the actor's public persona, ironic, detached, prone to disappearing without explanation, concealed genuine artistic seriousness. Murray read the Rushmore screenplay and recognized Herman Bloom as an opportunity to explore something he'd rarely been allowed to access on screen, a kind of existential exhaustion that couldn't be resolved through comedy, a middle-aged melancholy that required neither explanation nor redemption. He agreed to do the film for scale payment, effectively working for minimal compensation in a low-budget production because the role interested him. Principal photography began in Houston in November 1997. Anderson returned to his hometown to film at St. John's School, which agreed to serve as the fictional Rushmore Academy, and brought a significantly more confident directorial approach than he'd displayed on Bottle Rocket. The intervening years had clarified his visual language. He knew now that the symmetrical compositions and precise color control weren't affectations but essential to his methodology. They created a world that was recognizable but not quite realistic, a heightened reality where emotional truths could be expressed through visual design. Robert Yeoman, the cinematographer Anderson had worked with on Bottle Rocket, returned for Rushmore with a clearer understanding of what the director was attempting. The two men developed an increasingly sophisticated visual grammar, the use of lateral tracking shots that moved parallel to the action rather than following characters, the deployment of overhead angles that transformed characters into design elements, the careful orchestration of color to denote emotional states. Max Fisher's wardrobe progressed through specific color palettes corresponding to his psychological journey. Rosemary Cross always appeared in earth tones that suggested her connection to authentic feeling versus the more stylized world Max inhabited. The famous montages in Rushmore, sequences showing Max's various extracurricular activities, his elaborate stage productions, The escalating warfare between Max and Herman demonstrated Anderson's expanding ambition. These sequences required meticulous planning, with each shot designed to function both narratively and as pure visual composition. The production designer, David Wasco, and his wife, costume designer Sandy Reynolds Wasco, became crucial collaborators in creating environments that supported Anderson's vision. Every prop, every set piece, every costume element carefully selected to contribute to the film's overall aesthetic coherence. One sequence in particular demonstrated Anderson's emerging mastery: Max Fisher's Vietnam War stage play, an absurdly elaborate production featuring real explosions, helicopter sounds, and elaborate pyrotechnics on a high school stage. The sequence required 3 days of filming and meticulous coordination between special effects, production design, and performance. It was simultaneously ridiculous and strangely moving, a perfect encapsulation of Max's character, his grandiose ambitions inseparable from his obliviousness to appropriate scale. Bill Murray's performance in Rushmore revealed dimensions that surprised even Anderson. The actor brought a quality of genuine sadness to Herman Bloom, a sense of someone who had achieved conventional success, wealth, family, social status, and found it completely hollow. His scenes with Schwartzman created an unlikely emotional center, two people at different life stages but sharing the same fundamental loneliness, the same sense of being intellectually alive in a world that seemed emotionally dead. Murray improvised frequently, finding small moments of physical comedy or verbal inflection that deepened rather than undermined the character's melancholy. The film's soundtrack, featuring British invasion rock from the 1960s, The Kinks, The Who, The Creation, was Anderson's first serious engagement with music as a structural element rather than background atmosphere. Each song was carefully selected to comment on the narrative, creating ironic counterpoint or emotional amplification. The opening sequence, set to The Creation's "Making Time," established a template Anderson would refine throughout his career. Music not as score but as emotional architecture, shaping audience response as deliberately as visual composition. Post-production extended through the first half of 1998. Anderson worked again with editor David Moritz, constructing a film that moved at a distinctive rhythm. Scenes held longer than conventional pacing would suggest, allowing awkward silences and small gestures to accumulate meaning. The final cut ran 93 minutes and felt both intimate and strangely epic, a small story told with enormous visual and emotional precision. Rushmore premiered at the New York Film Festival in October 1998, nearly 3 years after Bottle Rocket's failure had seemingly ended Anderson's career before it began. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Critics recognized that something significant had occurred, not just a good second film, but a genuine artistic leap. The New York Film Festival audience gave the film a standing ovation. Festival programmers immediately began discussing it as a potential awards contender. When Touchstone released Rushmore theatrically in December 1998, starting with limited release in major cities before expanding, the film found the audience that Bottle Rocket had never located. It earned over $17 million domestically, modest by blockbuster standards, but substantial for a quirky independent film with no major stars. More significantly, it received widespread critical acclaim and awards recognition. Bill Murray won the Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actor, delivering an acceptance speech that thanked Anderson for letting me do something real. The success of Rushmore accomplished something essential for Anderson's career. It established him not as a promising debut director who had failed to deliver, but as a genuine auteur with a distinctive visual and narrative language. Film critics began writing seriously about Wes Anderson's world, analyzing his symmetrical compositions, his use of color, his concern with precocious children and disappointed adults, his ability to balance irony and genuine emotion. Anderson was 29 years old. He had spent 7 years, from the initial Bottle Rocket short film to Rushmore's release, developing his voice, learning his craft, and surviving the industry's indifference. The success felt simultaneously vindicating and terrifying. He had proven he could make films that connected with audiences and critics. Now the question became whether he could sustain this success, or whether Rushmore would prove to be an unrepeatable peak. The answer would require an even bigger gamble, a project so ambitious and expensive that failure would likely end his career permanently. He was already writing it, already envisioning a film that would expand his visual language to encompass not just a prep school but an entire family, not just Houston but New York City, not just quirky characters but genuine tragedy. He was preparing to make the Royal Tenenbaums, and everything would depend on getting it exactly right. Part 4: The Royal Tenenbaums and the Consolidation of a Style. The offices of Touchstone Pictures in early 1999 hosted a meeting that would determine the trajectory of American independent cinema for the next decade. Wes Anderson, still riding the critical and commercial success of Rushmore, arrived with Owen Wilson and a screenplay they had spent 18 months developing. The project was titled The Royal Tenenbaums, and it represented an exponential increase in scope, ambition, and required budget compared to anything Anderson had attempted before. The screenplay told the story of the Tenenbaum family, Royal, a disbarred attorney and absent father, Ethelene, his estranged wife, and their 3 children, Chaz, Margot, and Richie, all of whom had been child prodigies who achieved extraordinary success young, then experienced profound adult disappointment. The narrative concerned Royal's attempt to reconnect with his family by faking terminal illness, a deception that forces the Tenenbaums to confront decades of accumulated dysfunction, resentment, and unexpressed love. What Anderson presented to studio executives was not just a screenplay but a complete aesthetic vision. He brought visual reference materials, photographs of New York brownstones, color palettes inspired by 1970s children's books, costume designs for each character showing their progression through the narrative, and detailed production sketches demonstrating the precise visual language he intended to employ. The presentation was obsessive, almost overwhelming in its specificity. Anderson knew exactly what the Royal Tenenbaums should look like, sound like, and feel like. The question was whether he could convince a studio to finance his vision. The budget he proposed was $21 million, more than double what Rushmore had cost, and a substantial sum for what was essentially a character-driven family drama with no action sequences, no special effects, and no obvious commercial hooks beyond Anderson's emerging reputation. Studio executives expressed concern about the financial risk. They suggested reducing the scope, simplifying the production design, perhaps setting the film in a less expensive location than New York City. Anderson refused. His intransigence on creative matters had become legendary among producers and executives who worked with him. He would listen politely to suggestions, nod thoughtfully, and then proceed to make the film exactly as he had originally envisioned. This inflexibility alienated some collaborators but earned respect from others who recognized it as artistic integrity rather than mere stubbornness. For the Royal Tenenbaums to work, it needed to exist as a complete world with its own internal logic, its own aesthetic rules. Compromise would collapse the entire structure. The breakthrough came when Barry Mendel, who had produced Rushmore, managed to secure partial financing from Touchstone, with the remainder coming from Scott Rudin, the legendary producer whose credits included The English Patient and The Truman Show. Rudin's involvement signaled industry confidence in Anderson's vision and provided access to A-list actors who might otherwise have avoided such an unconventional project. By mid-1999, The Royal Tenenbaums was greenlit with a budget that would allow Anderson to realize his complete vision. The casting process demonstrated how significantly Anderson's status had changed in the 2 years since Rushmore. For his first film, he had struggled to cast unknown actors and secure supporting performances from established character actors. For Rushmore, Bill Murray had worked essentially for free as a gesture of faith in the material. Now, for the Royal Tenenbaums, Anderson could pursue genuine stars and expect them to seriously consider roles in his peculiar family drama. Gene Hackman, one of the most respected actors of his generation with credits including The French Connection, Unforgiven, and The Conversation, initially rejected the role of Royal Tenenbaum. He found the character unsympathetic, a neglectful father who lies to manipulate his family, and questioned whether audiences would tolerate such an irredeemable protagonist. Anderson flew to New Mexico where Hackman lived, bringing the screenplay and a portfolio of visual materials, and spent an afternoon explaining his vision. Royal wasn't meant to be likable, but he was meant to be human. His selfishness was real, but so was his late-life recognition that he had wasted his relationships with the people who mattered most. Hackman later described the meeting as unusual. Most directors pitched roles by emphasizing the character's heroism or sympathetic qualities. Anderson did the opposite. He emphasized Royal's failures, his narcissism, his fundamental inability to be the father his children needed, and then asked Hackman whether he was interested in playing someone who tries, unsuccessfully but sincerely, to become a better person too late to undo the damage he's caused. Hackman reconsidered and accepted the role, attracted by the complexity Anderson was offering. Angelica Houston took the role of Etheline Tenenbaum, the family matriarch who had held everything together during Royal's decades of absence. Houston brought gravitas and a particular kind of weary elegance to the character, someone who had transmuted disappointment into dignity. Ben Stiller was cast as Chaz, the business prodigy turned paranoid single father. Gwyneth Paltrow became Margot, the adopted daughter and playwright whose emotional withdrawal masked profound pain. Luke Wilson played Richie, the tennis champion whose unrequited love for his adopted sister had derailed his career. The supporting cast demonstrated Anderson's increasingly sophisticated approach to ensemble filmmaking. Bill Murray returned in a smaller role as Raleigh St. Clair, Margot's neurotic anthropologist husband. Owen Wilson played Eli Cash, the Tenenbaums' neighbor and Richie's best friend, a successful novelist whose substance abuse concealed desperate insecurity. Each character was given distinctive visual markers, costume elements, color palettes, props, that immediately communicated their psychological state and narrative function. Principal photography began in New York City in December 1999, an ambitious production that would require coordinating multiple location shoots, elaborate production design, and an ensemble of major actors with conflicting schedules and strong opinions about their characters. Anderson was 30 years old, directing a film with 10 times the budget of his debut and a cast that included multiple Academy Award winners. The pressure was extraordinary. The production faced immediate challenges. New York in winter presented logistical difficulties, unpredictable weather, limited daylight hours, the chaos of filming in a densely populated city. Anderson's insistence on precise visual control often conflicted with the practical realities of location shooting. One sequence required filming on a particular Manhattan street during a brief window of ideal natural light. The production had permits for 3 days, but Anderson spent the first 2 days adjusting camera positions by inches, refining the composition until it matched his internal vision. The crew grew frustrated, actors waited in trailers, and the production manager warned they would lose the location if they didn't complete filming by the 3rd day's end. Anderson remained outwardly calm but internally certain the shot mattered. In his conception of filmmaking, every frame carried equal weight. There were no throwaway moments, no establishing shots that existed merely to convey information. Each composition needed to function as both narrative device and aesthetic object. On the 3rd day, with barely an hour of suitable light remaining, he finally achieved the precise geometry he'd been seeking, a symmetrical tableau of the Tenenbaum house that would become one of the film's iconic images. The Tenenbaum house itself represented Anderson's most ambitious production design to date. Rather than finding an existing brownstone that approximated his vision, he worked with production designer David Wasco to extensively modify a building in Harlem, transforming it into a fantasy version of New York intellectual aristocracy. Every room was designed with meticulous attention to color coordination, period detail, and psychological specificity. Chaz's bedroom retained his childhood red Adidas tracksuit aesthetic. Margot's space was dominated by browns and creams, reflecting her emotional withdrawal. Richie's room, with its tennis memorabilia and falcon cage, suggested arrested development frozen at the moment of his career collapse. These design choices weren't decorative flourishes but essential storytelling elements. Anderson had developed a filmmaking philosophy where mise-en-scene, everything visible within the frame, carried as much narrative weight as dialogue or performance. A character's relationship to their environment revealed psychological truth. The Tenenbaums lived in museum-like spaces filled with artifacts of past achievement, their present selves haunted by the prodigies they had once been. Gene Hackman's performance as Royal Tenenbaum proved revelatory in ways that surprised even Anderson. The actor brought a roguish charm to Royal's manipulation, making the character simultaneously despicable and strangely sympathetic. His scenes with the child actors playing young Tenenbaums and flashback sequences demonstrated remarkable tonal control. Royal's neglect was real, but so was his genuine affection, creating a portrait of failed fatherhood more complex than simple villainy or redemption would allow. The famous montage introducing each Tenenbaum child's early success, Chaz's business ventures, Margot's playwriting, Richie's tennis career, demonstrated Anderson's expanding mastery of visual storytelling. Set to the Rolling Stones. She smiled sweetly. The sequence compressed years of character development into minutes, using production design, costume, and precise composition to convey enormous amounts of psychological information without exposition. Each child's prodigy status was presented with deadpan sincerity, the absurdity of their achievements, Chaz buying real estate at age 12, Margot winning a $50,000 grant at age 14, treated as simple fact within the film's internal logic. Bill Murray's smaller role as Raleigh St. Clair allowed Anderson to explore a different emotional register than the melancholy of Rushmore's Herman Bloom. Raleigh was ineffectual rather than depressed, a man whose anthropological fascination with human behavior coexisted with complete inability to understand his own wife. Murray played the character with a kind of befuddled earnestness that made him both pathetic and oddly dignified. His scenes with Margot, particularly their awkward attempts at marital intimacy, captured a very specific kind of emotional disconnection that characterized multiple relationships in the film. The cinematography by Robert Yeoman reached new levels of sophistication on the Royal Tenenbaums. The camera movements were almost exclusively lateral tracking shots or static tableaus, creating a visual language that emphasized composition over conventional cinematic dynamism. Characters often moved through frame rather than the camera following them, producing a slightly distanced, observational quality that allowed audiences to appreciate the elaborate production design while remaining emotionally engaged with the narrative. Anderson's use of music evolved significantly on this production. Mark Mothersbaugh, formerly of the band Devo, composed an original score that blended synthesizer textures with orchestral elements, creating a sonic palette that felt simultaneously contemporary and timeless. This original music was interwoven with carefully selected existing songs, Nick Drake's melancholy folk, The Velvet Underground's experimental rock, Paul Simon's introspective pop, each track functioning as emotional commentary on the narrative. One sequence in particular demonstrated Anderson's synthesis of visual design, performance, music, and editing, Ritchie's suicide attempt. The scene could have been melodramatic or exploitative, but Anderson filmed it with the same precise aesthetic control that characterized the rest of the film. Ritchie removes his tennis headband, cuts his hair and beard, and slits his wrists, while Elliott Smith's Needle in the Hay plays. The sequence is devastating precisely because of its restraint. The camera remains static, the editing refuses to sensationalize, and the production design, the white bathroom tiles, the specific shade of red blood creates against them, transforms potential exploitation into genuine tragedy. Post-production extended through most of 2001. Anderson worked with editors Dylan Tichenor and David Moritz, constructing a film that ran 110 minutes and moved at a deliberate, almost stately pace. Test screenings produced mixed results. Some audiences found the film's stylization alienating, its characters too eccentric to generate emotional connection. Others responded with intense enthusiasm, recognizing that Anderson had created something genuinely unique, a family drama that felt simultaneously intimate and theatrical, realistic and fantastical. Touchstone and Disney executives grew nervous as the release date approached. They had invested $21 million in a film that defied easy marketing categorization. Was it a comedy? The subject matter, suicide, addiction, family dysfunction, suggested otherwise. Was it a drama? The tone was often absurdist, the performances heightened rather than naturalistic. The marketing campaign struggled to convey what the Royal Tenenbaums actually was, eventually settling on emphasizing the ensemble cast and critical praise for Anderson's previous work. The film premiered at the New York Film Festival in October 2001, barely a month after the September 11th attacks had transformed American cultural landscape. The timing seemed catastrophically bad. Who wanted to see a quirky family drama when the nation was in collective trauma? But something unexpected happened. Audiences responded to the Royal Tenenbaums with surprising intensity, finding in its portrait of a fractured family struggling toward connection something that resonated with the broader cultural moment. The film wasn't escapism, but it offered a vision of damaged people finding their way back to each other, of forgiveness coexisting with acknowledgement of genuine harm. The theatrical release in December 2001 exceeded all expectations. The Royal Tenenbaums earned over $71 million domestically, becoming Anderson's first genuine commercial success. Critics were divided. Some found the film precious and mannered, while others recognized it as a masterpiece of contemporary American cinema. Roger Ebert gave it 3.5 stars, praising its visual style so distinctive that you can freeze almost any frame and identify it as a Wes Anderson shot. The New Yorker's Anthony Lane called it the funniest film of the year and one of the saddest. The film received Academy Award nominations for Best Original Screenplay, Anderson and Wilson, and Best Actor, Gene Hackman, though it won neither. The nominations themselves represented validation. Anderson had moved from the margins of independent cinema to mainstream recognition, his distinctive style no longer a liability but a marketable asset. More significantly, the Royal Tenenbaums consolidated what critics and audiences now recognized as the Wes Anderson aesthetic: symmetrical compositions, elaborate production design, curated soundtracks, ensemble casts of damaged eccentrics, narratives balancing irony and genuine emotion. This style would be endlessly imitated, parodied, and analyzed over the coming decades. Film students would write dissertations on Anderson's use of color. Other directors would adopt his visual techniques, often without understanding the emotional purpose they served. Anderson was 32 years old. In 6 years, he had gone from complete unknown to one of the most distinctive voices in American cinema. He had created 3 films, Bow Rocket *, Rushmore, and The Royal Tenenbaums, that functioned as a coherent artistic statement, each building on and refining the innovations of the previous work. The question now was whether he had exhausted his subject matter and style, whether future films would simply repeat established patterns, or whether he could continue evolving. The answer would require venturing beyond the American settings and family dynamics that had characterized his work thus far. It would require embracing even more elaborate production design, experimenting with different narrative structures, and testing whether his aesthetic could function in radically different contexts. He was already planning his most ambitious project yet, a film set on a boat in the middle of the ocean, featuring stop-motion sea creatures, a documentary crew, and Bill Murray as an oceanographer modeled partially on Jacques Cousteau. It would be called The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, and it would push Anderson's methods to their absolute limit, determining whether his distinctive vision was genuinely elastic, or whether he had simply perfected one very specific way of making films. Everything he had built, the critical reputation, the commercial viability, the artistic credibility, would be tested by whether he could successfully expand his world beyond the templates he had established. The persistence that had carried him from a Houston bedroom to Hollywood success would now require something additional: the courage to risk everything he had achieved in pursuit of something he hadn't yet proven he could do. Part 5: Mastery, Evolution, and the Vindication of Vision. The years following the Royal Tenenbaums marked a peculiar inflection point in Wes Anderson's career. He had achieved what most independent filmmakers could only fantasize about: critical recognition, commercial viability, and complete creative control. Studios now trusted him enough to finance increasingly elaborate visions. Yet this success created its own pressures. The Wes Anderson style had become so recognizable that every new project faced the same question: was he refining a distinctive aesthetic or simply repeating himself? The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, released in 2004, represented Anderson's most ambitious and divisive work to date. The film centered on Steve Zissou, an aging oceanographer and documentary filmmaker seeking revenge against the jaguar shark that killed his partner. The production required constructing a full-scale research vessel, creating elaborate underwater sequences with stop-motion animation, and coordinating an international shoot that spanned Italy and the Mediterranean. The budget swelled to $50 million, more than double the Royal Tenenbaums and an almost incomprehensible sum compared to the $5 million bottle rocket. Bill Murray's performance as Zissou demonstrated the actor's complete trust in Anderson's vision. He played the character as neither heroic nor particularly sympathetic. Zissou was vain, jealous, professionally declining, emotionally stunted, yet somehow still capable of moments of genuine wonder. The relationship between Anderson and Murray had evolved from the director-actor dynamic of Rushmore into something closer to artistic collaboration. Murray understood instinctively what Anderson was attempting: to create characters who were both absurd and heartbreaking, whose emotional authenticity emerged from rather than despite their stylized presentation. The film's commercial reception was disappointing. The Life Aquatic earned only $35 million worldwide against its $50 million budget, making it Anderson's first financial failure since Bottle Rocket. Critics were divided more sharply than they had been for any of his previous work. Some found it self-indulgent and emotionally cold, the visual elaboration overwhelming the human story. Others defended it as Anderson's most ambitious work, a film that expanded his aesthetic into genuinely experimental territory. The New York Times called it an interesting failure, a phrase that captured the ambivalence Anderson now faced. But something crucial had shifted in how Anderson approached his work. Rather than retreating from the stylistic maximalism that had characterized The Life Aquatic, he doubled down on it. His next film, The Darjeeling Limited, 2007, took his aesthetic to India, following three brothers on a spiritual journey through Rajasthan. The production faced enormous logistical challenges, filming on actual moving trains, navigating Indian bureaucracy, coordinating elaborate costume and production design in remote locations. Anderson treated these obstacles not as limitations but as opportunities to further refine his methods. The Darjeeling Limited performed modestly at the box office but demonstrated something essential. Anderson's style was genuinely portable, capable of functioning in radically different cultural and geographical contexts. The film's treatment of India bothered some critics, who found Anderson's aesthetic imposition on Indian landscapes and culture to be a form of colonial appropriation. Others argued that Anderson wasn't trying to represent India realistically but using it as a setting for exploring his ongoing themes of family dysfunction, emotional repression, and the search for authentic connection. The film marked Anderson's first collaboration with composer Alexander Desplat, replacing Mark Mothersbaugh and beginning a partnership that would profoundly influence his subsequent work. Desplat understood that Anderson's films required music that could be simultaneously playful and melancholic, that could support the visual elaboration without overwhelming the emotional content. The score for The Darjeeling Limited, blending Western orchestration with Indian musical elements, created a sonic palette that matched Anderson's visual hybridity. In 2009, Anderson released Fantastic Mr. Fox, his first animated feature, and an adaptation of Roald Dahl's children's book. The project represented both a logical extension of his aesthetic. Stop-motion animation allowed for even more precise control over every element of composition, and a genuine departure from his previous work. The film required learning an entirely new production methodology, working with animators rather than live-action crews, and adapting someone else's story rather than writing original material. The 3-year production of Fantastic Mr. Fox tested Anderson's collaborative abilities in new ways. Stop-motion animation is extraordinarily labor-intensive, with animators spending entire days to produce seconds of usable footage. Anderson's perfectionism, which could be indulged in live-action filmmaking through multiple takes, now meant that mistakes required weeks or months to correct. The film's distinctive look, deliberately rough, textured, with visible imperfections in the animation, emerged partly from Anderson's recognition that pursuing absolute perfection in stop-motion would make the production financially and temporally impossible. The voice cast included George Clooney, Meryl Streep, Bill Murray, and Jason Schwartzman, among others. Anderson recorded the actors outdoors in various locations rather than in traditional recording studios, believing that the environmental sounds and natural vocal variations would make the performances feel more authentic. This methodology, spending significantly more money and effort to achieve a quality that most audiences wouldn't consciously notice, perfectly encapsulated Anderson's approach to filmmaking. Fantastic Mr. Fox received widespread critical acclaim and solid commercial performance, earning over $46 million against a $40 million budget. More significantly, it demonstrated that Anderson's aesthetic wasn't limited to live action or to his own original stories. He could adapt existing material while making it unmistakably his own. The film received an Academy Award nomination for Best Animated Feature, losing to Pixar's Up but establishing Anderson as a serious presence in animation. The critical and commercial success of Fantastic Mr. Fox repositioned Anderson for his most ambitious live-action project, Moonrise Kingdom, 2012, a story about two 12-year-old lovers who run away together on a New England island in 1965. The film represented a return to American settings and Anderson's ongoing fascination with precocious children, but with a level of visual and narrative sophistication that exceeded his previous work. The production required casting two unknown child actors, Jared Gilman and Kara Hayward, in the lead roles, a risk that recalled Anderson's decision to cast unknown actors in Bottle Rocket. But where that early film had struggled to find its audience, Moonrise Kingdom had the advantage of Anderson's established reputation. The supporting cast included Bruce Willis, Edward Norton, Frances McDormand, Tilda Swinton, and Bill Murray, all actors willing to subordinate their usual screen presence to Anderson's larger vision. The film's setting on the fictional island of New Penzance allowed Anderson to create another complete world with its own internal logic, its own color palette, dominated by yellows, greens, and blues, and its own rhythms. The production design transformed various Rhode Island locations into an idealized 1960s New England that never quite existed but felt emotionally true. Every costume, prop, and set decoration was carefully selected to contribute to the overall aesthetic coherence. Moonrise Kingdom premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in May 2012, opening the festival to enormous acclaim. The film eventually earned over $68 million worldwide against a $16 million budget, making it one of Anderson's most commercially successful films relative to its cost. Critics embraced it almost universally, with many arguing that Anderson had finally achieved perfect synthesis of his stylistic control and emotional accessibility. The film received an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay. More significantly, Moonrise Kingdom seemed to answer the criticism that had dogged Anderson throughout his career, that his elaborate visual style created emotional distance, that his characters were precious constructions rather than genuine human beings. The central relationship between Sam and Susie, two lonely, peculiar children who found in each other the understanding that adults couldn't provide, was genuinely moving precisely because of, not despite, Anderson's stylistic presentation. The film's success provided Anderson with unprecedented creative freedom for his next project. He had proven he could work in animation and live action, in American settings and international locations, with original material and adaptations. The question now was whether he could synthesize everything he had learned into a work of genuine mastery, a film that would represent not just refinement of his established methods but their apotheosis. The Grand Budapest Hotel, 2014, became that film. Set in a fictional Central European country between the world wars, the story followed the adventures of Gustav H., a legendary concierge at the titular hotel, and Zero Mustafa, the lobby boy who becomes his protege and heir. The film employed a nested narrative structure, a story within a story within a story, and utilized three different aspect ratios to distinguish between time periods, a formal innovation that demonstrated Anderson's ongoing evolution as a visual storyteller. The production was Anderson's most elaborate to date, requiring the construction of an entire mountaintop hotel in Germany, period-accurate costumes for hundreds of extras, and coordination of an enormous ensemble cast that included Ralph Fiennes, F. Murray Abraham, Saoirse Ronan, Edward Norton, Adrian Brody, Willem Dafoe, Jeff Goldblum, Harvey Keitel, Jude Law, Bill Murray, and Tilda Swinton, among many others. The budget reached $25 million, a substantial sum that reflected both the production's complexity and Anderson's proven ability to generate returns. Ralph Fiennes' performance as Gustav H. provided the emotional center the film required. Gustav was simultaneously ridiculous and heroic, his elaborate manners and refined sensibilities existing in increasingly tragic contrast to the rising fascism destroying his world. Fiennes delivered Anderson's rapid-fire, stylized dialogue with balletic precision, while never losing sight of the character's fundamental decency and courage. The performance demonstrated what Anderson's aesthetic could achieve with an actor of genuine classical training willing to trust the director's vision completely. The Grand Budapest Hotel premiered at the Berlin Film Festival in February 2014 and became Anderson's greatest commercial success, earning over $174 million worldwide against its $25 million budget. The critical response was overwhelmingly positive, with many critics recognizing the film as a masterpiece of contemporary cinema. Roger Ebert's successor, Matt Zoller Seitz, called it Anderson's best film to date, a work that synthesizes everything he's learned about visual storytelling into something approaching perfection. The film received 9 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director, Anderson's first nomination in that category. It won 4 Oscars for production design, costume design, makeup, and original score, recognition of the extraordinary craft that had always characterized Anderson's work. Though it didn't win Best Picture, that award went to Birdman. The nominations themselves represented vindication for a filmmaker who had spent 20 years developing an aesthetic that many had dismissed as precious or superficial. What the Grand Budapest Hotel demonstrated conclusively was that Anderson's style wasn't emotional evasion, but a different kind of emotional honesty. The film's elaborate visual construction created a world beautiful enough to make its destruction genuinely tragic. Gustav's refined manners and aesthetic sensibility weren't affectations but forms of resistance against barbarism. The film argued, implicitly, that caring intensely about surfaces, about beauty, craft, and civilized behavior, was itself a moral position in an increasingly brutal world. Anderson's subsequent work continued this evolution. Isle of Dogs, 2018, his second animated feature, demonstrated his stop-motion animation had become even more sophisticated, while its setting in a near-future Japan showed his aesthetic could function in science fiction contexts. The French Dispatch, 2021, an anthology film about journalists at an American magazine in fictional France, allowed him to experiment with narrative structure while celebrating the craft of writing and reporting. By 2025, Anderson had directed 11 feature films over nearly 30 years, creating a body of work that demonstrated both remarkable consistency and genuine evolution. His aesthetic, the symmetrical compositions, elaborate production design, curated soundtracks, ensemble casts, had become so recognizable that Wes Anderson's style was now a widely understood cultural reference, imitated in everything from commercials to music videos to social media content. But imitation revealed something essential about Anderson's achievement. His style couldn't simply be copied. The geometric precision, color coordination, and deadpan performances that characterized his work were technical elements that could be reproduced, but they functioned in service of something deeper, a worldview that treated aesthetic control as both emotional defense and genuine expression, that found beauty in melancholy and absurdity in tragedy. The boy who had arranged action figures on his bedroom carpet in Houston had become one of the most distinctive filmmakers of his generation, someone whose vision was so complete and so uncompromising that it had bent an entire industry to accommodate it. He had achieved this not through compromise or adaptation to market demands, but through sheer persistence, through treating every frame of every film as though it mattered absolutely, through refusing to distinguish between commercial and artistic success. Wes Anderson's career demonstrated something essential about creative work, that distinctive vision, pursued with sufficient dedication and craft, could eventually create its own audience and its own standards of evaluation. He hadn't succeeded by giving audiences what they thought they wanted. He had succeeded by creating something so complete and so genuinely his own that audiences learned to want what he was offering. The 13-year-old boy who had written in his notebook that he would become a filmmaker had done more than achieve that goal. He had demonstrated that persistence, the willingness to keep working when Bottle Rocket failed, to refine methods when critics called his style precious, to risk commercial disaster by making the life aquatic, to continue evolving rather than simply repeating successful formulas, could transform private vision into public art. His films would endure not because they perfectly captured reality, but because they created alternative realities so carefully constructed that they revealed emotional truths conventional realism couldn't access. In a film landscape increasingly dominated by algorithmic decision-making and risk-averse studio calculations, Anderson had proven that genuine authorship was still possible, that a single artist's obsessive vision could produce work of lasting significance. The boy who built worlds in his bedroom had spent his career doing the same thing on increasingly larger scales, with bigger budgets and more elaborate tools, but always with the same fundamental instinct, that if you controlled every element precisely enough, if you cared intensely enough about every small detail, you could create something that felt both completely artificial and emotionally true. And he had been right.